What's going on, my friends? Manny here. Welcome back to another video. Today we're finally getting into a bit of a more detailed analysis of the Migranya Profunda Ascent that I did back in Spain, which was highly requested by you guys, and since this is such an endurance monster, I thought why not put an emphasis on resting. So over the course of this video I want to give you 5 tips for improving your shakeout game. Now, as a little intro, let's start with some basics. We can roughly divide all routes into 3 different categories. First, we've got very bouldery routes, which only have one short difficult sequence, sometimes even only one single move. Well, a boulder, so to say, as the crux, as the main contributor to the grade. Secondly, we have power endurance test pieces, which contain a tough, longer sequence of hard moves back to back as the crux. And thirdly, we have those routes which are long, with lots of resting positions and one super pumpy crux as the main contributor to the grade. And it's exactly these routes which demand a good ability of the climber to shake out, to get rid of the pump properly, and that's the terrain where you will get the most out of these 5 tips that I want to give you here. Keep in mind also that, of course, in climbing there's no black and white. Of course, there are bouldery endurance routes and power endurance-y shakeout bouldery routes whatsoever, and all kinds of mixtures. Note also that this is not a training video on how to train aerobic endurance, which is the main physiological requirement for shaking out properly, but rather a lesson on how to behave in the actual route itself to maximize your resting efficiency as much as possible. And as a side note tip, I will add that in my opinion, simply getting onto a lot of these routes is at the same time one of the best trainings for attaining aerobic endurance in the first place. Enough boring stuff, let's get started. In the meantime, we arrived at the first rest after a couple of hard moves in the first section, and the first tip that I want to give you is always focus on the arm that's hanging, never on the arm that's holding. Give as much attention as possible to the arm that's shaking out. You can see it here how I look down and focus on my hanging arm. The reasons for this are of both psychological and physical nature. If you are looking down at your shaking arm, you can imagine how new oxygen is entering your muscles through your arteries and how formed lactate, which represents pump essentially, is transported away through your veins, which you can actually see on the surface of your forearms. This could really be a form of bio-visualization or whatever you want to call it, that actually works. Thinking about it will make it happen more. On the contrary, if you look at your holding hand while resting, you will focus on grabbing because you're looking at the grabbing hand, and eventually you might grab more than necessary, resulting in more pump than necessary. That's the psychological aspect. The physical aspect is that once you're looking down at your shaking arm, your whole upper body opens up much more, as you should see here, allowing also other muscles to relax more, especially in the core area, which means they can recover too alongside with the resting arm. So that's why always focus on the shaking arm. Look down at it, ignore the holding arm, hang in there with as much friction as possible to save as much energy as possible. It's actually a very important one. Tip number 2 I want to mention in connection with this first rest as well. Always think about what's coming after the rest and adapt your resting behavior accordingly. For this one, I'm gonna bring the pumpometer into the game. In this example, because I already knew the route, I knew that the first crux comes right after this rest. Big move with the left hand onto a pretty bad crimp, which you have to hold as hard as possible, and then 2 more moves from this to a quite good pocket for the right hand, and then an easier jump into the next rest. For me, that means in this rest I have to keep my left hand as fresh as possible to be able to crank down that crimp later. I can achieve that by resting a bit at the expense of the right hand and shaking the left hand longer. This will result in an asymmetrical pump when I start climbing again. The left hand will be fresher than the right one, which will hopefully allow me to stick those crux moves. Now here comes a little bonus tip. Sometimes you will encounter a situation where you have to crimp an edge super hard immediately after a rest. It can happen that you're not able to hold it in this case, although your fingers feel relatively fresh. The reason for this is that your muscles have adapted to a bigger, usually more open hold, the resting jug, and therefore a more open gripping style, not allowing you to crimp properly directly afterwards. Now you have to trick your fingers into a more crimpy gripping style again before continuing to climb, and this is something I did here as well, because I knew that my next left hold would be that super small crimp. As you can see, I searched for a little crimp substitute close to the rest and crimped it for a second or two just to make my fingers ready. The cool thing is that little crimp substitutes are almost everywhere, which means this strategy is possible in almost any rest, I guess. Alright, we arrived in rest number 2, total climbing time 2 minutes and 20 seconds, of which 50 seconds time spent in rest number 1. This was the crux of Migranya, by the way, which goes straight up from there and is 8B on its own. We're gonna go to the left though and add another crux, making it 8B+. Time for tip number 3, foot placement, and this is of course a crucial one. It's hard when you're on-site climbing, but take your time and try to find the perfect foot constellation for your rest. We also often forget that when checking out a route, because we get the resting jug in our hands and can't really imagine that there will be any problems at all. But I can tell you from experience, feet can really make or break a resting position. Generally, it is advisable to look for 2 relatively spread out footholds to the side, so that you can get kind of a split legs position which supports your arms nicely while resting. Also watch out for heel hooks, they can really make a rest golden, and of course make use of knee bars if you happen to find them. All this stuff is gonna help you a lot. In this particular example I don't have any of that available, so what I did was I stepped the foothold to the right with my right foot and flagged my left foot underneath, and just by doing so I discovered that there is a second foothold even more to the right for my flagged left foot, allowing me to shake out at least my left hand nicely, which just got destroyed in the crux before. Notice, however, that my right foot is constantly under tension because there is no possibility for my left foot to step properly. This is something you have to keep in mind too in regards to upcoming climbing. Maybe you have to step a super small foothold right afterwards, which requires a lot of foot tension, and in this case it can be beneficial to rest that foot a bit by shaking it out as well, if your resting position allows it. Sometimes you can also step your resting footholds with your heels to save energy in your toes, and for this it is actually very useful to be flexible in the hips. Adam Ondra is a true master in this. Alright, enough foot placement, let's move on through that next section, and here I want to drop tip number 4, keep shaking during climbing. Another very useful tool in your endurance toolbox. Of course it is not always possible, but in general, if the sequence allows it, which most of the time just means that the sequence is easy enough for you, simply throw in some short shakeouts in between your moves. This will delay newly emerging pump or might even allow you to keep climbing without increasing the pump at all. Think about it this way, when you're resting, it is actually the same as climbing on the spot, always grabbing the same holds. If the route continues on jugs, you can just as well throw in some moves in between your shakeouts and at the same time proceed to your target, the anchor. If the terrain is too hard, however, it is more efficient to sprint through, save time and rely more on your power endurance. So, if you can, make use of little shakeouts in between your moves or little moves in between bigger shakeouts depending on your situations. We are arriving in rest number 3, total climbing time 5 minutes and 15 seconds, time spent in rests, rest number 1 50 seconds and number 2 2 minutes and 10 seconds, which makes a total resting time of 3 minutes so far. Rest number 2 was considerably longer actually, and this is because rest number 2 is also better than rest number 1. And also, as you might have noticed, since we have a pure climbing time of 2 minutes 45 seconds, the resting time already exceeded the climbing time. And this is a classical characteristic of a real endurance route, you know, you're actually spending more time resting than climbing. Time to drop tip number 5, and I've talked about this one before, breathe. Now, if you want more detailed info on breathing and pump control, I'd suggest you to watch this video here, in which I go into more detail about breathing frequency, depth, and so on and so forth. I threw this in here because rest number 3 is a very breathy one. Lots of grunting, trying desperately to replace the pump by fresh oxygen and stuff like that. This is a super painful rest actually, because you have this good undercling hold for such a long time. but you're standing in a complete overhang, which is sucking out your core and upper body. It costs so much skin as well. I rested super long there, 4 minutes and 35 seconds, because I wanted to be fresh enough for the upcoming second crux. And then cruising through the second crux into the rest number 4. Now the hardest parts of the route are actually done and there is no need to fall there anymore. Although I have to say I had my heartbreaker in the very last belly at the very last quick draw, but that's another story actually. Now cruising up to rest number 5, and here I want to drop a little bonus tip as a reward for those who watch this video to the very end. Once you've arrived in a rest, do not clip instantly. It is very often the case that routes are bolted in a way so that you can clip the next quick draw from the resting jug, which only makes sense because it's very easy to do from there and it's also very safe. But when we are coming out of the recent crux and we are super pumped, super much adrenaline in our heads, we tend to clip instantly because we are a little bit afraid of falling for no reason actually. And yeah, you should avoid that because this way you're pumping up one arm even more. Rather, start shaking out instantly and get rid of some of the pump instantly and clip later. You're usually in a safe position anyway, so take your time. This will keep your climbing a bit flowier by keeping your resting times as short as they need to be. Which leads me to the last interesting question. When should I continue climbing again? That's a hard one and only you can answer it for yourself in any given situation. You have to feel it. Just ask yourself, will you get fresher if you keep shaking even longer? Or should you rather just continue now and therefore retain some of your climbing flow? I have the impression that most climbers, including myself, tend to shake out too long, which is kind of reflected by the total climbing time on this route here, which was 18 minutes and 10 seconds, and a resting time of roughly 12 minutes. So 2/3 of the actual climbing time on Migranya Profunda here was actually spent on resting. So yeah, that's definitely something to think about and experiment with, I'd say. So that's about all I've got for today. Long enough, I'd say, just like this route. If you found it helpful, let me know down below via some opinions and likes. I'd highly appreciate it. And until then, I'll see you soon in the next one. Keep crushing, my friends. Bye.